Hello, I'm David Hardesty. In this lecture, we examine the taxation of U.S. companies when they earn income in treaty countries. The objectives of this lecture are as follows: to understand the basic approach to taxation of U.S. companies in foreign treaty countries, to understand when an online company has a permanent establishment in a country, to understand the attribution of business profits to a permanent establishment, and to understand the treaty protections for non-business income. Let's start with a look at the basic rules for the taxation of U.S. companies that make sales to customers in foreign treaty countries. As explained in the text at 11.05, in order for a U.S. company to be taxable on business profits from its sales to customers in a foreign country with which the U.S. has an income tax treaty, which we refer to as a treaty country, two tests must be met. First, the U.S. company must have a permanent establishment, or PE, in the country. And second, business profits must be attributed to that permanent establishment. With regard to non-business income, such as royalties that are not attributed to a permanent establishment, taxability is determined by the tax treaty. Where non-business income is not provided for in a tax treaty, then the taxpayer is usually subject to the tax laws of the country in which the income arises. That is, if the non-business income is not provided for in the treaty, then it is usually not protected by the treaty. Royalties and dividends are often provided for in tax treaties. In this course, we are concerned with royalty income because technology companies are often the licensors or licensees of copyrights and patents. Royalties are ordinarily covered by tax treaty. The most common provisions in treaties related to non-business income are exemption from income for royalties arising in a treaty country and reduced tax rate on such royalties. The key to taxation of the business profits of a U.S. company in a foreign treaty country is the existence of a permanent establishment in that country. So let's start by looking at the definition of a permanent establishment. As discussed in the text at 11.051, a permanent establishment is defined by most U.S. tax treaties as a fixed location in a country through which business is transacted. The phrases fixed location and business is transacted are terms of art, especially as they relate to electronic commerce. A fixed location can include any type of business premises, including an office or factory, and in some cases a web server. As we will see, special rules exist to determine when a web server constitutes a permanent establishment. When we refer to business being transacted, we're referring to core business activities. Auxiliary and preparatory activities taking place in a location do not create a permanent establishment. The best way to illustrate the existence of a permanent establishment is through a discussion of the special rules for web servers. As discussed in the text at 11.052a, under Commentary on Tax Treaties issued by the OECD, a web server is a PE, or permanent establishment, if the server is at the disposal of the taxpayer, which ordinarily means the server is owned or leased by the taxpayer. The server is at a fixed location, meaning the server remains at one location for a sufficient amount of time for that location to be a fixed location. And core business activities are carried on through the server. Whether the period of time at a single location is sufficient for that location to be fixed is generally determined by OECD commentaries and court cases in various countries, as discussed in the text at 11.052a(3)i. As discussed in the text at 11.052a(3)i, core business activities include those activities for which the business is organized, but do not include auxiliary and preparatory activities such as advertising or supplying information. For example, core business activities of an online retailer would include taking and processing orders. However, merely advertising merchandise would not constitute a core business activity. Just because a taxpayer has a permanent establishment in a country does not mean that sales to customers in that country are automatically taxed in that country. Business profits must be attributed to the permanent establishment before they are taxable in the country in which the permanent establishment exists. As discussed in the text at 11.06, where there is a tax treaty based on either the U.S. or OECD model tax treaties, a company with a permanent establishment in a foreign country is subject to income tax in that country in which the permanent establishment is located, only on business profits that are attributed to that permanent establishment. This principle is illustrated by a discussion of the attribution of business profits to a web server. As discussed in the text at 11.062, when a web server is a permanent establishment, the amount of business profits attributed to the server is determined through a functional analysis of the value of the activities taking place on the server. By this, I mean the functions taking place on the server are analyzed to determine the amount of profit they are generating for the business. It is this profit that is attributable to the permanent establishment and is taxable in the foreign country. Examples discussed in the text include various combinations of web servers with and without personnel, standalone versus multiple servers, and services that own intangible assets versus those that do not. As discussed in the text at 11.062CI, the key drivers for attributing profits to a web server are the assets owned by the permanent establishment in which the web server is located and the business risks assumed at that location. If the location does not own any assets other than the server, and the business risks are assumed at a different location, then little profit is attributed to the web server location. The theories surrounding a web server as a permanent establishment and the attribution of profit are important, so let's take a look at a comprehensive example. Webco is a U.S. company engaged in providing online services for a fee. In order to gain better access to the market in country X, a country with which the United States has an income tax treaty, Webco leases a web server in that country and co-locates it with a country X hosting company. By co-location, I mean that Webco controls the web server, but the hosting company has the server on its premises and maintains the server for Webco for a fee. The server provides online services to customers in country X. All of the software and data necessary to provide the service is uploaded to the server from Webco's U.S. offices. The server is programmed and operated by Webco personnel in the United States. Webco has no other assets or personnel in country X. Because the server is controlled by Webco, and because core business operations take place on the server, and because the server is at a fixed location, then under the rules discussed earlier, we can consider the server to be a permanent establishment in country X. Note that country X may have additional requirements for a permanent establishment, such as the required presence of personnel. But for purposes of this example, let's assume that the server is a permanent establishment. If the web server is a permanent establishment, we must perform a functional analysis of its operations to determine the amount of Webco's profits that should be attributed to the server and taxed in country X. In this case, the assets are clearly owned in the United States. This is because the income-producing assets, which include primarily the software and data on the server, were developed by U.S. personnel. In addition, all of the significant business risks associated with the operation of the business are assumed by the U.S. company. Business risks in this case include primarily money invested in creating the software and data, administrative overhead, and marketing and advertising costs. Because all of the assets used on the web server belong to WebCo in the United States, and because all important risks are assumed in the United States, only minimal profit should be attributed to the web server under the treaty. This profit may be, for example, some minimum return on the value of the property located in country X. Let's finish with a discussion of the taxation of non-business income. As discussed in the text at 11.07, most tax treaties address the taxation of certain non-business income. The most common are royalties and dividends. Non-business income for this purpose is income that is not business profits as defined by the treaty and is not attributed to a permanent establishment in the country. Our primary concern in this course is royalties, and this is the only type of non-business income we will discuss. Ordinarily, under U.S. tax treaties, royalties are not taxed in the foreign country in which they arise. Instead, royalties are taxed only in the recipient's country of residence. However, in some U.S. tax treaties, royalties are taxed in the foreign country, but are taxed at a rate set out in the treaty. Ordinarily, this rate is considerably lower than the country's statutory tax rate on royalties. For example, a foreign country's normal tax rate on royalties earned by a foreign company may be 30%, but under the treaty, this rate may be reduced to 5%.